Introducing the diva of Jewish storytelling, Peninnah Schram. Peninnah has wowed and mesmerized audiences around the world with her theatrical performances. She has authored 13 books and produced a CD. I am one of her many students at Stern College, and some of them have gone on to become storytellers themselves. Tonight, we will have a moderator. Reuven Russell will be moderator. He has taken over Peninnah Schram's role as the head of the speech and drama department at Stern College, and he's also the YU artistic director. So now let us hear Peninnah's story.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Shalamis. And we're here tonight. As you said, you called her a diva, so that word's already out there. So I'm not making it up, but the great Peninnah Schram, we're here. And a beautiful book has just come out, which I'll show everybody, called Peninnah's World. And the author is Caren Schnur Neile, with a beautiful foreword by Don Ben Amos. And there's the book there. We will give you a link and let you know how you can get this book, but it's certainly available on Amazon and through the publisher. And we're here tonight to also explore what this fascinating world of storytelling is all about. You know, I think in the Jewish tradition, there's something called Ein Yaakov. What is Ein Yaakov? Ein Yaakov is a marvelous collection of stories and parables culled from the Talmud. All the non-legalistic stories and of the Talmud. And the idea is that the stories, as we see in the Talmud, have, on a certain level, a much deeper meaning and essence than the straightforward legalistic findings. If there's an idea that is very deep and coming from a very high place, it's through the stories of the Torah and the Talmud that we learn and we extract meaning and depth from them. And I'll just give you one little brief little explanation of what I'm talking about here with Ein Yaakov. And it was Rabbi Schnur Zalman, the Baal HaTanya, the founder of Chabad, who said this in a letter to his Hasidim. He said, "Therefore, my beloved ones, my brethren and friends, give glory to the Lord your God before it grows dark," meaning between Mincha and Ma'ariv, the afternoon service and the evening service, by studying every weekday in groups of 10, the inner essence of Torah, meaning the Agada, contained in the work of Ein Yaakov. For most of the secrets of the Torah are concealed in it, and it atones man's sins, as explained in the writings of Rabbi Isaac Luria of blessed memory. As to the revealed non-mystical passages in the Agada, these are the ways of God in which a person ought to walk, and they enable him to take counsel in his soul in heavenly matters, such as Torah and mitzvahs, and in worldly matters, as is known to all the wise of heart. So, stories in the Talmud, stories in our heritage in Judaism are not merely stories. They are not merely bedtime stories or children's stories, but often have the deepest significance and the deepest meaning. So with those opening words, Peninnah Schram, welcome. Welcome. You have a lovely audience here tonight. And let's start with your love of stories, Peninnah. And how did you get to love stories?
Oh, thank you, Reuven, for that question, because I began to love stories from early childhood because I was blessed with two parents, both my mother and my father, who loved stories. And they understood that there is wisdom embedded in stories, even the silly stories in our Jewish oral tradition. And so my mother, who was the wisest woman in the world, would tell me stories that are teaching tales, didactic tales, to teach me a lesson, especially, for instance, to restrain my anger. And so she told me this story over and over and over. And I would say, Ma, I don't want to hear that story again. I've heard it 100 times. And you know what she would answer? You'll hear it 101 times, my child. Because she knew, as she would say, it will come in handy. And believe me, it did. This is the story, how to restrain your anger. In Russia, in the Tsar's army, young men were drafted for 25 years, sending them to Siberia, and especially for the Jewish young men. Who knows, after 25 years in Siberia, in the Tsar's army, who knows if they would remember that they were Jews, or maybe they weren't able even to return home. One Jewish young man was drafted into the Tsar's army, and he had to leave his wife, and they were waiting for the birth of their first child, but he had to leave. 25 years passed, and this soldier came back home. He was wearing the army uniform. He had a revolver there in his holder. And when he arrived at the house, he noticed that the door was open, and he heard two people speaking. One voice was of his wife, but the other voice was of a man. And overcome with jealousy that his wife had taken a lover, this soldier took out the revolver, kicked open the door, ready to shoot that lover of his wife. And just at that moment, the man said, "Mame, mame." And in a split second, the soldier coming home realized that this was his son. And he dropped to his knees, thanking God that he had not shot his son. Oh yeah, Ma, you made it up. No credibility. I didn't want to hear it again and again, but I did. And then many years later, fast forward, I was researching for stories for my first anthology, which is called Jewish Stories, One Generation Tells Another. And in a book called Sefer Hasidim, I don't know if you can see the book. Am I holding it right? It's filled with stories that are didactic, that are teaching stories, that give you the Jewish values and the behavior, because stories, as you heard from Reuven, are really much more than just entertainment. It's the most beautiful way to teach, through the stories, because they also remain in your memory much longer than any lecture or talk. And in these stories, this one story suddenly seemed very, very familiar. That's my mama's story. Oh, so she didn't make it up. But this book is from the 13th century. And so they didn't have a Tsar's army then. They didn't have revolvers then. And the story was about a Jewish merchant who would go off on a ship trading all kinds of merchandise. and stayed away from the house, from his home for many, many, many years. And so you know what happens when this man, this merchant, returns home. He doesn't have a revolver, but he has a sword. And the rest of the story, you know. Well, I want to assure you that my daughter and my son know this story very well, because that's what happens from generation to generation. The story becomes a folk tale, a story that the people need to know and to learn from. And so this story came from the 13th century through the generations, through the centuries, until it became a Tsar's army. My father's stories I loved. My father was a chazan, a cantor, a sheched, a ritual slaughterer, and a moel, a circumciser. And he was very knowledgeable, of course, in Torah, in Talmud, in Midrash. And I loved my father's stories. In fact, the stories, especially Elijah the prophet, I would ask my father to tell them over and over and over and over. Because these earliest stories that you can remember and retrieve influence you and actually shape you to the person you become. It's so important to remember, to try to remember those formative stories that you were told as a young child. I was 4 or 5 years old, those earliest memory years, and the story was of Elijah the prophet. Papa, would you tell me the story where Elijah whistles? And my father always stopped what he was doing to tell me a story. Elijah the story. Elijah the prophet, who told many stories and is actually in the most stories that we have in all of the Jewish oral and written tradition. In all the centuries, it's Elijah the prophet that really comes through. Elijah the prophet is a master of miracles and also a master of disguise. You never know who is Elijah, maybe sitting in the next Zoom rectangle to you. Sometimes he was a handsome horseman, sometimes a beggar, sometimes an old traveler, weary. You never knew. Sometimes there are stories where Elijah is himself Elijah, and we know it is right from the beginning. But I like to guess who was Elijah in these stories. Elijah the prophet would walk from place to place. He would watch how people talk to each other, how they act with each other, and he would observe and he would witness and he would remember. One day, Elijah, in the disguise of a weary traveler, came to a small town, and there he was looking around and saw this little small cottage with a lot of broken windows, and the shutters were broken. But there was something he liked when he looked around the yard. There were flowers, there were trees, even a pomegranate tree. And he said, I will stay here for a while to rest. In this cottage, a poor couple lived. They had very, very little. When Elijah knocked on the door, when the couple opened the door, seeing this very tired wanderer, they invited him in. They brought water for washing and invited him to sit at the table for some food. And the wife put whatever she had, and she said, it's just some black bread and herring. But when a guest comes, it feels more like a banquet. And they spoke Torah words, and at the end, Elijah said, I must leave you. No, stay, it's dark and cold outside. No, I will leave you, but I will leave you with 3 wishes. for your wonderful hospitality. Whatever 3 wishes you wish will be yours. And he looked at the husband, and the husband said, we are content with whatever we have, but I do have a lot of books, and I would like to have a bigger house. Elijah the prophet gave a whistle, and instead of that little cottage that was there, in place of that little cottage, there was a mansion. Then Elijah looked at the woman, and the woman said, my clothes are very torn and not so nice anymore, and maybe some jewels. And Elijah the prophet gave a second whistle, and the couple, both of them, had beautiful, handsome clothes, and the wife had some jewels. And then as a third wish, the couple called out, gold, gold. And Elijah gave a whistle a third time. And instantly there were piles and piles of gold coins, more than you could spend in many, many lifetimes. And Elijah the prophet disappeared. Time passed. Elijah was thinking, I wonder how that man and woman are using their wealth and how they are living now. And so, in the disguise of a beggar, he returned to that mansion, but what he saw, he did not like. Shutters closed over the windows. Not a single flower, not a single tree, not even that pomegranate tree. And the fence was around the house with guards and dogs. And when the dogs saw the beggar there, they began to bark and make noise, and the master of the house came to the door to see what was the commotion. And when he saw that it was a beggar there, he said, get out of here, beggar, or I'll get those dogs after you. This is how you treat beggars and guests. Elijah gave a whistle, and all the gold coins disappeared. Elijah gave a second whistle, and the very handsome clothes and jewels disappeared. And then Elijah whistled a third time. And in place of the mansion, it was again the little cottage. And the couple looked at each other. For the first time, they realized how miserly and greedy and selfish they had become, and how poor they were, even with all the riches in the world. That was the story my father told me, and that I asked for over and over and over. And so, as a professor, I'll give you homework. Try to find in your memory bank some of those earliest remembered stories and write them out without going to the source, and see what you remember, what you've forgotten, what you've changed. But those stories are treasures because they are really a key for you to understand how you became who you are. And so I was blessed with a wonderful mother and a wonderful father who understood the wisdom needed that we could get from the stories.
Thank you, Peninnah. So beautiful. Wow. Wow. Well, one thing I learned from Peninnah, and as Shulamis mentioned in the introduction, maybe those of you who weren't here, I took over at Stern College for the teaching that Peninnah did. How many years, Peninnah, were you there?
45 years at Stern College. And 2 years before at another college.
45 years, holy smokes. Well, in her last years, and I started there in 2006, I sat in class and watched what Peninnah did. And one of the things I remember her mentioning to her students was the nature of description. And when you tell a story, there's a lot of describing going on. And I remember one thing that so sticks with me, I use it every semester when I teach my students, which is when you tell a story, you have to see it. You have to see it in your mind's eye. When you see it, your audience will see it. And I'm sure right now, the story that you just told, how many people saw the mansion? How many people saw, the gold, both coming and going, right? It's so for those of you who tell stories, see it, really see it, because if you see it, we'll see it. So, Peninnah, let's ask you about 45 years at Stern College. Well,
I was blessed. Woo.
It would be so interesting to hear how that all began.
With pleasure. But I wanted to say one more thing, building on what you just was talking about, is that there's a paradox. I am telling you a story, but you are the storyteller. In other words, the imagination, image is yours. It may be very different from mine, but I have to see it, imaging it in my imagination, and then you can reinterpret that story. You're drawing your own painting of it and telling yourself that story.
And the way we tell it to ourselves and the way I see it may be different than how, let's see, Judith or Marty or Robert or Paula or Maish.
Exactly that. And that's the beauty, because it's fluid and it's alive. It's alive, and one can never tell the same story the same way. So much changes, and but you have to be present at every note. This was Andres Segovia anecdote where a reporter asked Mr. Segovia, when he was already in his 90s, the classical guitarist, the great classical guitarist, Mr. Segovia, you play some of the same encores or the same pieces in hundreds of thousands of your concerts. Don't you ever get bored? And Segovia looked at that young reporter and said, I am never bored because I am present at every note. And I learned that from my father as a chazan. And whenever he would daven at the Omed, and he lived into his 90s, he was never bored. Everything was, he was present at every note. And a storyteller has to be that way.
The artist has to start with a blank canvas every single time.
Yeah.
He can't do his masterpiece over again. He has to start with a blank canvas every single time.
Standing on my one foot, not my foot, but 1 foot. I'm going to go through, I don't know how many years until I get to Stern. Because
and by the way, let me just say that if anybody has any questions that you think of in your head, you can put them in the chat, put them in the Zoom chat, and we'll take a look at them, and then we'll leave a few minutes towards the end and hopefully get to some of those questions. So I just wanted to let everybody know, if any questions come up, put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Go ahead, Peninnah.
Thank you for remembering that too. So standing on 1 foot, I was born and grew up in New London, Connecticut. Growing more, I went to college. In grad school, that's when I met the love of my heart, And then we lived in Paris for 2 years. You'll read about all of these adventures, by the way, in the book, of course. And we, with Baruch Hashem, we had a daughter and then a son. And then tragedy struck us because I became a widow with 2 very young children. Shortly after that, I began teaching at a college in Westchester. And then a miracle happened. Reuven, would you please read an excerpt from the book, and you'll hear the way Caren Schnur Neile has composed these stories in what she calls a bio-storying approach. But this way you'll hear Karen's writing of that, how did I get to Stern College? And you'll hear Reuven's wonderful reading. Thank you.
It was the spring of 1968. She had to admit that she and the children had settled into a sort of routine, although unsettled often felt like a more appropriate word. One day after work, she was sitting at her kitchen table opening mail when she came upon a cream-colored envelope, and opening it, she realized it was an invitation to a wedding reception for a man she and Irving had known mostly in Europe, Jim Goodfriend. And excuse me, but I have a little lighting issue here. Okay. This is what live television used to be like. This friend, Jim Goodfriend, who they had known mostly in Europe, they hadn't been close, but were fond of him and had gotten together a few times back in New York. There were a few things she wanted to do less in those days than attend a wedding. It wasn't purely that she was feeling so alone. She hadn't been to a party since the night of Irv's death, and this event at the Grand Concourse Plaza in the Bronx promised to be a lot more than simply dipping her toe into the waters of social life. She sat down to send her regrets, holding the pen inches above the reply card. She certainly wasn't going to tell them that she was alone and didn't know anybody besides the groom and couldn't bear to attend. She would have to make up an excuse. Then her father's voice came to her, almost as though he were whispering into her ear. It is a mitzvah to celebrate with the bride and groom. Okay, she said aloud to the 4 walls. I'll go and fulfill the mitzvah. I'll say mazel tov. I'll have a nice dinner and I'll come right home. She filled out the reply card, marked the date on her calendar, and didn't give it another thought. 6 weeks later, she walked into the reception hall in the Bronx, wearing a cocktail dress she had unearthed from her closet, feeling conspicuously out of place in the midst of so much elegance with the blazing chandeliers and the well-heeled crowd. Still, she told herself she had decided to come and was determined to make the best of it. As soon as she was able, she delivered her mazel tovs to the bride and groom. That task complete, she figured that since she had come all this way, she might as well have some sustenance. She picked up a drink from a passing server. She hadn't taken 3 steps toward her table when she heard, "Peninnah? Hello." It was one of her former professors at Teachers College, Peggy Clark, whose husband worked with the groom and was his best man. "Who do you know here?" Peggy asked after giving her a hug. They chatted for a few minutes. Suddenly, Dr. Clark said, "Come with me. I want to introduce you to someone special." Taking her arm, She led Peninnah over to the table of a distinguished-looking older man. Dr. Tauber, she said, this is Peninnah Schram, a brilliant former student of mine. Peninnah, this is Dr. Abraham Tauber, the chair of the speech and drama department at Yeshiva University. Actually, more than the chair, he founded the whole program. There are moments that happen during the course of a life that when you look back at them later, should have been accompanied by a clap of thunder or a display of fireworks, or at the very least, the clanging of a gong. When Peninnah talked for a few moments with Dr. Tauber and his lively, attractive wife, Rhea, however, she knew only one thing. She hoped to be friends for life with the lovely Mrs. Tauber. What she couldn't know, couldn't possibly have imagined, was what was to happen next. From humble beginnings in the Lower East Side of New York City in 1886, Yeshiva University had grown into a prestigious, multifaceted institution of Jewish and secular learning that boasted an acclaimed teaching hospital and had conferred honorary doctorates on the likes of Lyndon Johnson, Robert Kennedy, and then future Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. So when Dr. Tauber called Peninnah soon after the wedding and asked her to interview for a position at YU's Men's College Uptown, she was floored. She met with Dean Isaac Bacon, who was disappointed to hear that she wanted to stay on at Iona for another year. It wasn't just that she felt the need of more teaching experience under her belt. She wasn't quite ready to take another job teaching only young men. But Abraham Tauber didn't forget her. In the spring of 1969, he called again. Hearing his warm, resonant voice, she immediately sat up straighter in her chair. "How are you, Peninnah?" he asked. "Baruch Hashem," she replied, summoning every bit of her acting training to control her feelings. As casually as she could, she asked, "How are you?" "Baruch Hashem. Look, something has come up. There's an opening in the speech and drama department at Stern College." She knew of Stern. It was the sister school to Yeshiva University downtown. "It's a good place to work. In fact, my daughter June is in the same department. I would like very much for the dean to interview you for an open position." She could hardly believe her luck. If she got the job, she could get to work by subway. Stern was in Manhattan, Lexington Avenue, 35th Street. No more car or train rides to New Rochelle, and she would be teaching young women. She soon interviewed with Dr. David Mirsky, who hired her on the spot. Not only would she make more money, but she would only be working 3 days a week. Iona had been good for her, but it had never felt quite like home. Maybe it was because her students were all male or that it was a Catholic college. Maybe it was the ride out of the city to New Rochelle. Whatever it was, now for the first time since Irv's death, she had found some place she felt like she might actually belong.
You've read that beautifully, and it's true. It was my home, my second home. Yeah. Thank you.
Wow. Can I read another excerpt from the book?
Sure. Which one?
About your life in Technicolor, right?
Oh.
What's that brilliant approach she called bio storytelling? Is that how you say it?
Bio storying. Storying.
Oh, storying.
Yes.
Right? Storying.
Say that. Yeah.
Let me see here. Yeah. It was the spring of 1968. Wait a minute. No, that's what I just read.
That was read, yes.
Okay.
It was written in Technicolor, yeah.
Oh,
But
that was that the excerpt of bio story?
Well, all of the whole book is an example of bio-storying, because each chapter is a self-contained story, a self-contained narrative, so that it is, it reads like a novel, if you will. And there's a certain, of course, we don't always remember exactly the dialogue. And so there, she makes that up, what would be fitting in terms of, so there's a certain amount of fiction, in other words, but it's all truth.
So let me ask you, so you got a job that started a whole 45-year reign
Yep.
at Stern College.
Yep.
But that's academic. That's you being a professor. How did you become a professional storyteller?
Aha. Well, telling stories to my children all the time, you know, I was telling stories, but a professional storytelling, meaning you get paid for telling stories, and you have a certain standard and repertoire and teaching. Anyway, just about the time that I was starting to teach at Stern College, I learned that just about 5 blocks from there on East 30th Street between Lexington and Park Avenue is the Jewish Braille Institute. And I volunteered, not for pay, if anything, I volunteered to record books from first word to the very last word. You don't leave out anything. And so I would go to the Jewish Braille Institute, and I would spend an hour or so recording. And one of the first books that they gave me to record was the very first children's collection of stories written by Isaac Bashevis Singer. The book is Zlata the Goat, 7 stories about Hanukkah, with either taking place in Helm or with the demon and his wife, the witch. And of course, I loved recording all of the books for them. I talk about mitzvot. And then I was walking back to Stern College one day, and I was feeling how happy I was to record these stories. I went home and told the stories of in Singer's book to my children. And then suddenly I had an epiphany. I love doing all of that. I love telling stories to my children, but I want to tell stories to children that I don't necessarily know in a class, in a program, and where we could do creative dramatics and learn values and themes and just have a wonderful time and use art as well. And so I made a proposal to the director of education at the 92nd Street Y in New York, which is a great cultural institution. And the director said, Dr. Nathan Kolodny it was, he said, you know, another storyteller, another young woman like you, gave me the same proposal, very similar to what you just told me. And I'd like to have the 2 of you meet, and I will get a patron who will underwrite this program. Let's do every week we would have a program for children 7 to 12 years old. I met the other storyteller, and we created a program called Fire, Water, Stone, and Air, the 4 elements of the world. And every week, either solo or together, we would tell stories, and we would do art activities and movement and dance and music and all kinds of creative dramatics based on the themes and the stories we were telling. Months went by. It was a very successful program. I told at that time stories from all over the world in world folklore. That one day I told an African folktale. At the end of the program, the children had all left. This other storyteller said, Peninnah, I don't want you to tell that African folktale anymore because I have it in my repertoire. you should tell only Jewish stories and leave the rest of the world to me.
Very humble person.
Shocked. It shocked me. It was so out of my dreams of ever thinking that somebody would say that to me even. And before I knew it, my eyes were filled with tears rolling down my cheeks. And I don't remember what I said, what I mumbled. All I know is that I was in shock for a long time. It wasn't a curse, perhaps, as much as it was a limiting command. And I was very careful not to tell stories from any other tradition except the Jewish oral tradition. And of course, I was building my repertoire. And then at some point, I realized that what she had done was not to give me a negative words or curse or whatever. She gave me a blessing in disguise. She gave me a blessing because she knew me maybe better than I knew myself, that I loved Jewish stories. I felt happier even telling stories from the Jewish oral tradition. And of course, I learned that there are variants not only amongst all the Jewish traditions of the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim and others, but we also tell so many stories that either were originated in other people's folk tales or it comes from our Jewish sources. It doesn't matter, we all tell more of the same stories than not. And so I thought, yes, this is what I need to do. I'm going to tell primarily Jewish stories, folk tales, fairy tales, tall tales, every genre of stories. We have them in our tradition. And then, believe it or not, right after that time, I got a phone call from the Jewish Museum on Fifth Avenue and 92nd Street. And they invited me to be the storyteller in residence in the Jewish Museum. Every month, I was to somehow compose or create a program using one of the exhibits in the museum as a springboard. And we would again I could use creative dramatics, I could use interaction, I could use improvisations, art, music, movement. I had a wonderful year there, and then a second year, and then a third year. And I then became a Jewish storyteller.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was a blessing, and I called her and I thanked her, and we still are very good friends.
Oh, really? That was my follow-up. So,
yeah.
Wow.
And I bless her, because had she not said that to me, I don't know whether I would only limit myself to Jewish. Of course, you're not limiting yourself. You are really opening up the world with Jewish stories and folk tales. Yeah.
Now, a few people have put some comments in the chat. We urge anyone who has a question to put it in the chat. But before we get to that, I think we would be remiss if you did not tell us the story, Peninnah, of when you were invited to teach at Boston University.
I'll do it very quickly because, I'm very fortunate and blessed because I've had mentors. Not all of them knew about it, that they were my mentors. And I had Elijah's opening doors for me, opening opportunities. And I blessed them all. And I named them in my book called Tales of Elijah the Prophet. So Elie Wiesel was one of my mentors. Years later, I did tell him this, but I learned so much from him. He was an extraordinary man. And where did I meet him? At Stern College. He was visiting or maybe setting up a talk or whatever with Dean Mirsky. And I happened to be passing by Dean Mirsky's office that day, and Dr. Mirsky said, Peninnah, come, I want you to meet someone. And he introduced me to Elie Wiesel. And when he said, this is Peninnah Schram, Elie Wiesel said with open arms, ah, Peninnah. And then he shook my hand. And I have a strong handshake, but nothing like Elie Wiesel's. It was quite a very strong. I remember it to this day. And this was in the 1970s. Well, Elie Wiesel was giving annual talks, a series of 4 weeks of 4 talks on biblical, Talmudic, Hasidic, and modern times, so that he would explore one person, one character, one Rebbe in from the biblical, from the Talmud, from the Hasidic world. And I would go, probably missed only a few, but what was even more wonderful is that I would watch him. I would listen to him. I would see how he used this musicality of his voice and how he used the meaningfulness of the phrasing and the eloquent pauses. And I just drank it in, and how he would segue from the talk to a story. He would say simply, listen, or he would say a story, or he would say, let us tell tales. And I loved going to hear him, and he was a teacher. I was learning with him. We were all learning with him in that auditorium. But what I loved is after each talk, he would go to the art gallery, and all the people who wanted to greet him would go to the art gallery. And when he would come out, we weren't in actual lines, but he would kind of wander between us. And when you saw that he was looking at you, you had those few moments to talk with him. And what I loved, when he would look at my eyes and I would look at him and I would approach him, again, his arms open, and he'd say, ah, Peninnah. And then there he would embrace me, and we would kiss on both cheeks. He would ask about, what am I doing? What am I writing? How is it Stern? And I would ask him some things. And after a few moments, he would go on to the next person. And in 1990, he called me up because every fall semester, he would teach a seminar at Boston University. And he was inviting me to come to Boston, to BU, and teach us a course, one class. And I thought maybe he was traveling and he needed a guest teacher. But when I finally got to Boston, he greeted me in his suite of offices, and then he escorted me to the class. And when he was introducing me to the students, I said, thank you, Professor Wiesel. But then there's an anecdote that I would love you to read and see what I said after I said thank you to his introduction. Take it away.
And thank you, Professor Wiesel. She looked at him and he smiled. To the class, she said, there's an anecdote about a chassid who would visit his Rebbe in a distant country just to watch him tie his shoelaces. To tell you the truth, and here she turned to her friend seated next to where she stood, I would have come just to watch Elie Wiesel tie his shoelaces. And at that, Wiesel stretched out his left leg and pulled up his trousers a few inches to reveal shiny brown loafers, and the class broke into laughter.
It's true. It happened exactly like that. And he laughed as loud as anybody. It was just beautiful.
Well, I know, the time is flying by here. Before we conclude with another excerpt from the book, Peninnah, I just want to let everybody know, this is the book. It's Peninnah's World. All right. And it can be obtained either on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or the publisher Hamilton Books.
Correct.
Hamilton Books. And what I'll do is I'll also put in the chat right now to everybody, Peninnah, if it's okay with you, I'll put in your email. Would that be okay?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And if anybody has questions about stories and storytelling, I'd be very happy to.
And maybe if somebody asked you really politely, you could even personally autograph a copy of a book for them.
Yes, indeed.
We didn't rehearse that. I just thought I'd throw that out there. So I'm going to put it in PININNAH1, correct?
Correct.
At AOL.com. There it is. And I'm hitting enter, and everyone should see on the chat. That is Peninnah's email right there. You click on that and you'll get right to the master herself. Let me see here on the chat itself here. Besides there being questions, there's a lot of praise. I won't say who this is from, just because, I would need permission for that. But this person writes, Peninnah, do you have any idea how much I love you and how much you have influenced my life? You have been my mentor, my guide, my friend. Thank you for helping me find my path.
Whoa. I wish I knew who it was. Are we going to be able to get a copy of that chat?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh,
Thank you. Thank you. But we have only a couple of minutes to 9:15, don't we?
Yes.
So I know that we were going to end with the prayers, the storyteller's prayer, but I'm going to just use one line. I think we're going to have to wind it up. Yes?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Yes. I mean, I'll just throw this out that I'd really like to learn more about the process in creating this marvelous book based on Peninnah's marvelous life. That's probably a longer answer than we have time for.
Oh, very much so. And maybe we need to do another interview and get Caren on Zoom. She's on a travel trip. So I was going to tell you about a storyteller's prayer, because we Jews are very wise. We have prayers that we say before we begin praying to prepare for praying. So why doesn't a storyteller need a prayer to be prepared? Because it is a sacred thing that we're doing. These are words and stories with such a mantle of responsibility that we have to teach. In fact, it was Elie Wiesel said once, I heard him, the most beautiful way to teach is through stories. And he also said, I rather share than teach. Teaching is wonderful, of course, but when you share, it's interactive. It's a dialogue. It's a conversation. That's what storytelling is to me. And I was very influenced by the Hineni prayer that the Chazan, the cantor, recites only 3 times on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur before Musaf. And we don't have time to read the story, the prayer rather. But I want you to know that it is at the end of the book on page 181. And it is also in my anthology, Jewish Stories, One Generation Tells Another. The storyteller's prayer is one that you might want to think of writing it yourself. But I do want to tell you about this. When Elie Wiesel, when I actually putting together, compiling the anthology, Jewish Stories One Generation Tells Another. I asked Elie Wiesel, I called him up. When he answered the phone, I was very nervous. And I invited him, I asked him, would he write a foreword for that book, for that anthology? And he said yes. Turns out what he contributed as an essay for the foreword was an essay called The Storyteller's Prayer. It is about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of Opt, the Opta Rebbe, the great grandfather of the 20th century Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He did not know that I had already written my own storyteller's prayer. We had no discussion about that at all. I knew then that Hasidim sometimes write a storyteller's prayer, but I never saw one. It was the Hineni that really inspired me. So when I told him this, he said, there are no accidents. The Opta Rebbe was a storyteller of tall tales, and he directs this prayer directly to God. I haven't got time to tell you or to read to you this very long prayer, but the last line is one that I love, I cherish, and I will tell it to you. The last line of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of Opt, of his storyteller's prayer, is this: Dear God, give me good listeners. Dear God, give me good listeners. And I think Reuven will agree with me that we had wonderful listeners tonight. And to listen, that's what we need in this world. To listen with a compassionate heart, with oh my goodness, with a listening heart. King Solomon asked, when God said, whatever you wish for is yours, he says, King Solomon, you'll see it in Kings, a lev shemaya, a listening heart, a compassionate heart, an understanding heart. And so as listeners, we need this in this world. And we also need, though, people that will tell the stories, retelling our biblical, Talmudic, Midrashim, folk tales, fairy tales, all kinds of stories, and also to tell and write even your stories of your life, the life experiences. It's been absolutely a great blessing to have this book. And I thank and bless Caren and all of the readers that I know about. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Reuven.
Thank you, Peninnah. Thank you so much.
You gotta do this again.
Absolutely. And anyone who knows Peninnah and has crossed paths with her in any way, I'm sure would agree with me. It has made you a better listener. You know, I think what you just said is something, you know, listening should be a course taught in colleges today, you know,
Yep.
just listening. But like you said, listening with your heart. So nothing could be more relevant and important than for us to really be able to listen with an open heart. And when you read this book, believe it or not, you'll also be a better listener, because it will give you a window into Peninnah Schram, who is one of my mentors, into her life and the fascinating life that it still is. And I want to thank everybody here. Shalamis, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks everyone for coming, and let's do this again.
Yes, and I want to thank you, Shalamis, my former student. and the person behind the stage. Thank you very, very much. And I know I left the speech and drama department at Stern College in excellent hands. And people, the students love you. And so can I say that? I love you too. Thank you,
so much,
Reuven.
Peninnah.
You
Thank you
are
so
a
much.
gem. Love you.
Thank you, thank you.
Bless you.
Much,
And
much
we need to
appreciated.
pray for shalom in the world.
Amen.
I mean, this was not a book talk. This was a performance. Two of you did a great job
Thank you.
with a short amount of rehearsal time. And thank you everybody for attending this. Without the listeners, we wouldn't have had a show.
Right. Well, we have to listen to ourselves by talking to ourselves.
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shulamis.